Muy buenos días a todos y a todas.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We will have a reflection opportunity in the midst of the Tax Policy and Human Rights Week. We will be talking about this same subject, but now in Central America. I have Jonathan Mencos and Fernando Rodriguez joining me, as well as Jose Maria Tojeira. So, to start, I'd like to remind you that if you want to follow our presentation in English, we have English interpretation. You can go to the interpretation icon and choose English and then mute original audio. So now I'd like to start with a small reflection, reminding that states, including Central American states, are aimed to guarantee the rights of human lives. And tax policies is the instruments that states have in order to guarantee rights. And if states do not have enough resources, then those citizens' rights won't be respected. So public budget reflect the truth priority of the governments and the states beyond the political discourse. At the same time, tax systems shows who's willing to build a society and provide input to a more equitable and egalitarian and just society, who's a free rider, acknowledging the complex inequality that limit the development of our societies, particularly in the Central American case, and facing the urgent need to transform a tax policy towards one that is an effective tool to contribute the transformation of our societies towards economies, towards systems, towards societies based on rights that put people first and that also prioritize environment sustainability. From 3 years ago, and through the interdisciplinary collaborative effort, a series of civil society organizations, experts, at an international level, as well as activists and social movements, started working on the consolidation of human rights standards that could act as guidelines and principles to the state to follow and respect the principles of human rights in designing and implementing tax policies. This is why today we are going to discuss on the connection between tax policy and human rights in the Central American context and the challenges of implementing the principles and guidelines on human rights in tax policy in some of the countries in the Central American region, acknowledging that even though we are similar among our countries, each has their particularities and their own dynamics that could determine the implementation of those principles. So to start, I'd like to ask Jonathan Mincos, Executive Director of the Central American Center for Tax Studies, to share his presentation and the potential of those principles when applied in the Central American region. Thank you very much, Lourdes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this fourth day of a day that has been quite intense, dedicated to tax justice and human rights, and in which we are introducing the principles and guidelines of human rights and tax policy. I'd like to start by thanking everyone that worked during this effort, and I really want to thank you for working so hard to be able to make tax policy and human rights meet. I would also like to thank you for inviting me to the expert committee, and I'm very pleased to share with you today, along with my colleagues Lourdes, Fernando Rodriguez, and Mr. Cojeira, the information that we'll be sharing that is just equal to a dream that have human rights respected in Central America. So human rights and tax policy are an input of Latin America to the world. So particularly in the context that we are living, the need to mitigate different economic, social, and political crises crises that appear to be recent. However, they have structural character. And we need to understand that we need to put people at the center of development, at the center of the debate on how to mitigate those crises. And I think that it is also important to consider the principles that we're launching and introducing because they allow us to move people from that center of the political debate to the center of actions debate. So, what redefining tax policy would entail? All of the rights are related to responsibilities, and introducing principles reminds us that those rights that are so discussed when talking about improving people's lives and controlling and protecting natural environments are rights that, of course, need responsibilities too, because the responsibility of guaranteeing human rights is a condition to human and natural resources as well as financial resources. At the center, we state that this tax policy is related to human rights context. So in tax policy, it is defined what rights are going to be protected and which ones are going to be delayed. In tax policies, the sense of justice and solidarity of any society becomes a specific one and concrete, because through policies, it is decided who's going to pay taxes, who's not going to pay, to what extent, in what percentages, which groups will be prioritized, and how much money is going to be invested in favor of equality, peace, and social cohesion. Tax policy also decides the extent of the public policy to collect and redistribute national wealth, the one that's collected collectively. And in tax policy, a good part of economic growth is decided, and it depends on that if the state or not is going to invest in production, in innovation, in education, and training of their workers. This is why it is so important to achieve a tax policy that's designed and executed with a human rights approach, one that's concerned by democracy, by people's development, and by the natural environment that surrounds them. So, in a counterposition of the content of the tax policy that's fundamented only in numbers, the one that turns ends into means, the one that's concerned about reducing the tax deficit, but by restricting the production of public services and assets without considering the social impact that it may have. The type of tax policy that has been rooted in the last 30 years that's based on austerity and on reducing taxes to those who have the most, and where daily life is commercialized. So the 15 principles developed in the framework that we are introducing today are organized in 4 spheres that allow to walk from general principles all the way to the non-state and supra-state responsibilities, coming through cross-sectional responsibilities that are applicable to tax policy. But because of time, I don't want to talk about the 15 principles per se, but I would like to just stress on 3 principles that we have to share on the current political discussion in Central America. Principle number 3 ensures that tax policy is socially just and fair. These principles refer to designing tax policy according to equality, legality, non-discrimination, generality, consecutive capacity, characteristics, as well as other principles that have been incorporated in those institutions by international law. But this principle also reminds us that we need to ensure that public spending has to be designed according to equality, legality, efficiency, priority of social spending. We also need to understand in this principle the need to protect public heritage and manage it according to current laws with due diligence and ensuring public spending. And last but not least, this principle reminds you that we need to manage public debt in such a way that it does not hinder the fulfillment compliance on conditions guaranteeing human rights enjoyment. Talking about this principle is very important in Central America since today tax policy in Central America distributes very poorly tax collection. For example, 10% of Central American population with highest income pays proportionately less taxes than the remaining of the society, the rest of society. We should say that there are a lot of regressiveness to the tax and collection system, the different regimes that offer tax privileges in those economic sectors because they're always the rich ones and they are never in charge of building a good society. On public spending, social spending is also insufficient to guarantee well-being and development, with some exceptions, efforts, that are greater in Costa Rica and Panama. But they evidence the lack of enough resources for social expenditure, and the millions of children and teenagers that are today outside schools, mainly in the four countries of the north of Central America. So poverty, where around 22 million Central Americans live, also reminds us that public spending is not enough and probably it is not properly designed. There are some studies that we have carried out from INSEF in the case of Guatemala. It reveals us that the public administration invests 3 times more in a person from two origins than in a person from originary peoples or an indigenous person. So this shows the huge gap that promote discrimination. We also know that corruption in the different levels of the government damage heritage and do not distribute the possibility to get results for public policies. Principle number 7 of the 15 principles of human rights and tax policy talk about tax policy having to be transparent, participative, subject to accountability. So people have rights and have the right to tax information and have the right to participate on tax discussions. So the proposal here is to produce, publish, and provide access to quality tax information, which should be built in a clear, understandable way, and it has to be available for everyone's consultation. Quality indicators should be created on the fulfillment of human rights. It is not enough just to say that 100% of budget was used. What's important to know is if that budget is providing results or any improvements in coverages in terms of utilities, if human rights are being met. And it is also important that tax policy is designed ensuring that the adoption of decisions in tax matters are open to a public debate, an informed debate, which is inclusive, broad, transparent, based on solid evidence from different sources, and of course through with a language that's understandable for most of the population. So in the Central American case, this principle is important because in the assessments that have been done periodically on open budgets, the ones that the budget partnership do, what appears to be and to have the higher red flags is citizen participation in tax discussion and budget discussion, because that participation is virtually null. We have been witness in Central America of the approval of laws without technical revision, where tax privileges are granted without considering cost benefit, without any assessment, and at times under suspicion. So approvals are done to laws that open ways for further corruption, and laws are further approved that provide impunity to corrupt. And we need to add that most of the reflection of those who rule are shared behind closed doors only with business people without having any communication with society. When talking about tax pacts, Those who are not on the table, they are going to be on the menu. And in Central American menus, most of the population have always been served. So I would like to close by quoting Principle 8 that refers to the right that populations have to adopt all of the financial and tax measures necessary for the effectiveness of human rights within a sustainable tax framework. And this principle shows that we have to establish laws and policies and adopt tax frameworks and financial regulations, budgets, debt management for the full performance of human rights. So different type of measures could be adopted, but we need to justify why they are being taken and if they are appropriate for human rights. We also need to ensure that tax policy is sustainable from a social and intergenerational perspective. And we should adopt a macro fiscal framework aiming to strengthen a tax policy to meet the obligations of human rights. So, to conclude, this principle talks about tax rules, and these should be oriented to guaranteeing rights, and they shouldn't be created nor applied in a way that could hinder or deter the responsibilities of states to meet human rights. From the Central American Institute of Tax Studies, we have calculated that Central American states, in order to meet most of SDGs, should increase spending and public investment in average around 4% of the GDP a year between 2021 and 2030. This means not only setting aside the government that's based on tax austerity, which is the current system in Central America, where public spending and investment is restricted, but also we need to sustainably increase tax collection and do it the best possible way, the most progressive way. And to this, we have to add the need to better plan development and to get a public institutionality that guarantees what we were discussing in previous principles: honesty and the best possibility of public policies to do their job. So it is a huge challenge, the one we're facing in Central America. So these principles come in a very valuable context in order to increase debate, reflection. We at the center consider that tax policy counts and counts a lot in building more democratic society, more peaceful society. So this principle should be very well known by governors, by Congress people, by ministers and secretaries, but they also should be disseminated and interiorized per each Central American citizen. Our job is to expand the communication so that this week of justice, of tax justice, goes to the rest of the days that we have in our lives. We are living a social agitation times around the world, particularly in Latin America. And this is a good time to remember that building societies that we mentioned, more democratic, more inclusive, more developed, is only going to be possible as we're able to guarantee, promote, and protect the rights of each and every one of the people, their communities, and nature. And for this, tax policy should turn into a tool that has been operated under human rights principles. And tax policy shouldn't be monopolized by governments, by political parties. On the contrary, tax policy should be constituted partly by the relate that citizens share, and that makes us be optimistic and that gives us a sense of a possibility of change and of a better future. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for providing us this introduction on how we can start reflecting on the way in which principles and guidelines or human rights in tax policy can be applied to the Central American context. Now, I would like to introduce Fernando Rodriguez Guerra. He is Costa Rican. He is a former vice ministry of the IRS. and he's also an academic consultant. So, Fernando, welcome. And now I would like to pass the floor to you so that you can share your reflections on how, from your experience as policy maker, as a public policy maker, tax particularly, what are those challenges that we can face when implementing a focus of human rights in defining tax policy? Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Lourdes. Good morning, everyone. Well, I have a presentation for you. And I'd like to start here to tell you that the Jonathan's presentation is amazing, especially on principles, because it's quite useful for me to be able to talk about the problems on formulating tax policies. When you see these type of efforts, you find all sorts of obstacles in order to be able to have a tax policy that's focused on human rights and considering to improving the life of people. Now, I like reminding this quote by John Kenneth Galbraith. He talked about political economy and tax policy in the US. And he would say, a third characteristic of those who enjoy a very good situation is a selective vision of the role of the state. Vulgarly and superficially speaking, the state has always been seen as a burden. No political declaration in modern times has been as frequently reiterated nor as ardently applauded as the need to remove the state from the backs of people. So the need to lighten or eliminate this burden is with corresponding taxes, which is an article, of course, that proves how most of these wishes have been met. When you try to analyze how they should analyze tax policies, the logical thing here, or what should be the typical aspect here, is that the social collective, that society should be the one deciding what we want for tax policy to do. And this should be step number 2. In this sense, when we think about that social model, society and state, we need to consider 3 essential aspects. Well, the structure of the government that's going to be created, because democracy is the model that we have, and of course, it's expensive, it costs. We need resources to have a sound economic basis and one that allows to rule on the basis of popular well-being, not only on the elite. This has to be very well controlled. And this is part of what the economic theory has defined. And we can find that the state should also generate funding to forbid public assets. For example, the ones that we see in theory, those assets to which a market cannot be developed. So there wouldn't be any rivalry or competition, and it would be possible gradually to create conditions to be able to establish a weight on it. So there is a public and possibility to fund them. But there are services that are fundamental to be able to guarantee the full enjoyment of fundamental rights in population. And this should be the third aspect that we have to consider in formulating and designing public policy. This last aspect also has a great advocacy in different fields, because we are not only talking about the differences in terms of access or in terms of people's income, but also the possibility to have access to a dignified work that can be guaranteed through the right investment in time. For example, through the right health conditions, right development conditions, for which we need, of course, public investment or even access to egalitarian type of jobs that allow to compensate cultural patterns that many times are adverse to the incorporation of women to workforce. This, of course, could also be rebated by tax policy as we focus on rights. If we don't do it like that, then this is what's going to generate inequality patterns in different fields. Nevertheless, if you consider Central America, unfortunately, and this is also something that Jonathan has already mentioned, tax policy has been decided through pressures caused by different groups, minorities, most of them, and very powerful in most of them. And what have done was create a policy that won't be enough to collect taxes, because going back to Galbraith's quote, what we need is to remove the burden from people's back and open the lines so that private investment can also be promoted. This hasn't happened like that because evidently the finance states, and of course it is very important to include the private sector, because if not, some countries, in the case of Guatemala and Costa Rica, that are very low tax burdens with a design of the tax system that's highly regressive. Unlike other countries that are members of the OECD, for example. So Central American ones have a system, a totalitarian system that's on the backs of indirect taxes. So we have to stop doing it with regressive taxes. So the Galbraith quote has been translated into a vision that has been feeding from the spill effect, the effect of trickle-down economics, that of course has been discussed by everyone because of what the US president has said about it. So if we let the private sector grow, and if we do not charge taxes, and if we do not disincentivize private initiative, then we are going to all be benefited, supposedly. And of course, this does not cause only for there not to have enough resources, but that it has been added to funding problems that generates generates problems in expenditure in other phenomena. For example, the high expenses in security in some countries that have had more problems, and all of the countries in the region have had problems with drug dealing, for example. But also in some cases, the case of Costa Rica and El Salvador, those expenses come up also because of the funding of public debt that reach very high levels, and at least in Costa Rican case, they have a very high cost because it is in Costa Rica one of the most expensive debt in the world, and that causes a displacement of available resources to address other expenses, particularly those with social impact. So as there are criticisms, well, the state is able to function for some things. During the last decades, and you can double check this in the different fields of different countries, economic elites haven't questioned the resources destined to the productive activities. So the state has done it very well, and it has participated. And it has allowed also to be a imbalancing element of the tax situation. So the government is the government expenditure, but if it offers incentives to specific groups, then it's not a problem for the state to participate, right? Well, it should be the primary functionality of the state in order to guarantee that there are conditions for promoting private sector. Of course, leaving aside other functionalities that the state should have, particularly the fact that it should guarantee the guarantee of fundamental rights through public spending specifically. So incentives to tourism, to financial income, direct subsidies and grants to export, as it has been said, and they have been traditionally seen as acceptable activities of this. So it turns out that the state can be seen as a productive symbol so that regressive instruments can be used for that end. As Jonathan says, at no time has a social impact been questioned or even the cost benefit of incentives provided, even if many of these can be unnecessary in the current coverage. So incentives are still there because there is a huge pressure for this to be granted. And of course, because of this, since there are no other income, there is a huge pressure to address other state activities that imply better access to services, hence meeting their full human rights. Now, these situations, unfortunately, is hard to change in the short and medium term, but the possibility to go over it would foster the fulfillment of rights, but it is conditioned to the balance of many interests. For example, for us to have a specific idea, well, those who would be benefited from these resources are left aside from the decision making. So one side we have those pressuring not to have a higher tax collection or to modernize the tax system, which is the most progressive. And on the other side, we have those who would be benefited from the state, from those resources that are collected. So most of the population does not participate. Of course, there are some exceptions because it is possible to, of course, redirect the path of policy. And by doing so, even if there could be exceptional cases, for example, the tax reform in Costa Rica 2018, the state had to reluctantly accept some things. It was not a progressive reform, but they had to accept some things instead of accepting that tax decisions would affect the country. Or recently, in the Colombian case, the reform proposal presented by President Duque was rejected in 2020. And normally, what's imposed in Central America is an interest collusion that can be seen the following way, where, for example, business sectors and specific companies with very specific and particular interests, sometimes even unions, social groups, the media, in other cases, even the public sector, work together for different reasons because there are direct interests in political parties or interest by different groups through funding to political parties or political players, protecting the status quo of particular benefits and interests. I already said that, particular interests. So through these interaction mechanisms, what happens is influencing in the legislative power, where there is a possibility or where there has been a proposal to do a tax reform at a legislative power level. So all of these sectors end up influencing so that two things can happen. On one side, we shouldn't increase the available resources that would guarantee an improvement of tax policy for human rights. And in other cases, we need to cut down social programs to address the needs of certain groups. Or number three, in order to promote very severe processes and very important adjustments of expenses, which are happening in the region for some time. That has caused important clashes that, of course, are also a result of the pressure of these sectors. So basically, what's on the bottom is a tax policy that's oriented to prevent the state from growing and to collect more taxes. And as a consequence, the state ends up failing as a right grantor when not being able to meet this function. I also wanted to share the Costa Rican case, a success case, another one that hasn't been that much, but that actually is failing. The case of the program of food, nutrition, and school and teenagers program. So it is not a program that benefits universally. It is focused, it has been centered, and it has expanded to places where it's hard to find another way of livelihood. So schools are everywhere, and at times the state goes to many places just through these educational centers. It has more problem to be able to have other representations or to reach other media, which allows to reach most of the potential beneficiaries. This has allowed for many children that in other conditions could spend days without eating, for them to have access to food at least once a day. And the program has been expanded by offering food during school holidays and during the weekends. So people that are benefited from these programs can have access to it during the entire week, during the entire year. Last year, even, there was a moment where, due to the pandemic, when schools closed down, there was a food package and it was delivered to the students so they could eat at home, which, of course, has had as a consequence low prevalence levels of nutrition, malnutrition, if we compare it with other countries in the region. This, of course, requires resources and investment, warranting buying food through different ways to bring this food to students, and promoting a series of measures to promote healthy livelihoods, because of course that's what's required. But it has been a success case. Now, one that hasn't been, and there is a pending theory, well, at the beginning of the past decade, there was a network created, a network of childhood protection, which at the webpage says it is a system of protection and development for the child, of public access that's universal, and of solidarity funding that articulates the different modalities of public spending and private in terms of services related to care and child development. So these type of comprehensive programs attempt for it to be an accessible alternative with the aim to allow the access of women to the marketplace. The problem is that the impact hasn't been achieved. Costa Rica is still a low percentage of penetration in workforce, lesser than other countries. Just for you to see it in numbers, out of the total of women that are in the workforce, 1.1 million women, so 42% of them, and these are numbers from the household survey, shows that they don't even look for jobs because they have to address the family responsibilities. They haven't found a way to conciliate their family responsibilities to looking for a job. So these women have at least one child between 0 and 12 years. So the mechanism will be useful for this group, because the child that they are in the average group age is receiving the benefit that's being created. And there are women that, besides having a child under their care, they also have an adult. So they have to care twice. They're a minor and a senior. However, the system in normal times, they have 60,000 children, which keeps a huge amount of beneficiaries. So if we have 249,000 women with children in age of enough descendants, that is not really being protected, well, then women will not really be able to be part of the workforce. And in many cases, it forces women to end up spending most, which reduces the available resources in order to address other needs at home. So, pending challenges, just to conclude. Well, to ensure a consistent tax policy with the fulfillment of human rights, Central America needs to increase the available resources with the process of progressive tax reforms. And I am talking about reforms in plural because when we have had very broad reforms, what ends up causing this is that the generation of a very strong population ends up just making everything tumble down. So we need to have some time spent fixing reforms and understand that this is going to force us to talk about the tax policy permanently for many years. In our countries, there is a huge reluctance to address these topics. Unfortunately, the proposals of governments recently has been quite regressive, and this generates a negative reaction from the citizens, but we also need to open up for opportunities and spaces to have a very big citizen participation. Available resources in many cases should be reoriented in order to address the cause of social problems and not to just bet on their repression. I think that this, of course, is particularly important in the case of problems with safety issues, where probably we will gain more betting on the reinsertion of many people that are in the place where we have problems, instead of just spending and spending in security and repressing those problems through the action of the police, and even worse, of regional armies. Central America cannot keep on drowning in a lost war against drugs, spending a lot of resources and also generating a lot of unsafety, insecurity, and affecting the population in the process that end up migrating to other places. Especially if we need to do this without an important financial support that bets on social development. Now, attention, these are the words of the president of the US. It is time to grow economy downwards upwards. It's more probable that we end up having an improvement if we inject resources not on security but in the recovery of the population, in addressing Central American population in order to foster social development in turn and leave behind the failed strategy that's just causing more insecurity in the region, more poverty, and especially the displacement of our population that ends up migrating to the US even. Now, the context and the discussion that we have currently on the minimum global tax, it is a good moment to consider how to improve transnational companies' input in the region at the same time as we bet on a systemic competitiveness improvement. We have to stop thinking that we're a country that we cannot produce. We need to look for the conditions to be better to produce and improving improving the overview and the environment for everyone. And especially it will improve tax collection. Instead of betting on granting tax exemptions that are not generating any structural change in Central American economies, and especially in the substantial improvement in the quality of life of the population in general. And last but not least, I think that we need to be very careful with long-term impacts of COVID-19. There will be with us for a long time, and not only because of the impact that it had in unemployment and poverty, and also because we are also be suffering long-term effects on health systems. So the pressure that's going to be over this is quite large, and the region is going to have to properly address the population. But COVID could prevent this, and this is not going to be solved by economic improvement, by rebound effects. This has to be clear. And recovering growth, once we are leaving the pandemic impact, won't affect unemployment and poverty increase, nor sustainability problems, maybe only healthcare systems long term. To guarantee that people, for example, have access to the right healthcare, we are going to have to invest more in health systems. And this is not only for us, but for everyone in the world. But in the Central American case, it's going to be particularly of importance because we have been carrying over previous problems that could aggravate as a root of this problem. So that's all I would like to tell you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Fernando, for your intervention. I would like to remind our viewers, those who are joining us, that you can send us your questions via chat for panel members. Now we are going to go to the Q&A session, and I would like to open the mic for Jonathan and for Fernando, and I'm going to ask two questions for you. One is, what are the myths on the role of the state and tax policy that still prevail not only in decision makers, Central American ones, but also between citizens? What are those myths that we have to debunk in order to have redistributive tax policies? And the other question is, we have the case of Guatemala, that as a result of tax matters and fighting against corruption, there were different demonstrations during 2015. So how can we get these processes to end up being political coalitions in articulated movements to move forward and promote tax policies that are more just and more progressive?
En el uso de la palabra, no sé quién gustaría.
Fernando, ¿quieres tú primero? Bueno, gracias. Gracias. Bueno, yo creo que debemos distinguir que hay algunos.
Well, I think that we want to differentiate the myths that are only narrative constructions, but in reality, those talking about those myths do not really believe it. One has to do with the state minimum. I mean, the myth where we have the idea that the state is not really meddling in the lives of people, and they have to really be like that, to have to stop meddling, to stop caring, and just leave people alone. That's what the narratives say, that the citizens do not demand from states the fulfillment of human rights, health, education, social security. But those who articulate that myth actually use the state in order to guarantee privileges, opportunities, power shares. So I think that this is one of the elements that appears and that they repeat on the media, traditional media, and many colleges and universities. They repeat that the state has to be small. In the meantime, those people creating the myth use the state to enrich themselves, selling services, building the roads of the state, of that minimum state, and making that state to just represent them, to sign free trade agreements, so that companies stop paying taxes, just like that. I think that's one of the main elements that we need to change, and that's why these principles are vital, because they are going to allow us to help to build a different narrative from a state that shouldn't be large nor small, but a state that has to be effective, so that we can meet what the Constitution has demanded. Search for a common good and complying with a development agenda would entail an increasing democracy. Now, on the other question on how we could achieve articulation processes, we must say that first of all, we need to create an awareness on what's today in dispute. Because actually what's today in dispute is the public power, if it is going to still belong to just some that do business with the public power, that maintain it, that corrupt it, that take money from that public power, and that also create their own impunity opportunities on all of the crookedness that they do? Or are we going to be able to understand that the public policy and the public power story needs to be an opportunity for collective development? Fernando already said it, and he put it in this presentation. Today, tax reforms are discussed behind closed door for benefit of some. So what we're seeing in Chile, in Colombia, reminds us that tax policy is important for effectiveness, for governability, and we are not in times where people didn't realize that they're falling under, putting on their backs the economic burden that discriminates and just provides winnings to just very little, profits very little. So I think that in these two Central American countries, these cases are just very concrete. Any political party, any political convergence on social media would be very legitimate if in the agenda we had this construction in tax policy that's just and that charges or collects the most from those who have the most. So in the Central American case, I think that we have the huge challenge of building a society that can see each other in the eye. I think that there's a construction where the problems of farmers, of rural workers are not related at all with urban problems, or that unemployment problems are not a problem that's a competence of public administration, just as well as lack of coverage in education or health. What's expected from the public power has deteriorated so much that today it's so hard for us to sit down and try for that public power to function in favor of majorities. But in all cases, what we've seen in 2015, in Guatemala, in Honduras, shows that tax aspects could be constituted at the center of a programmatic debate on what the states have to do in the future. We are optimistic in terms that more communication, more reflection, and more awareness on the problems that tax policy can understand will result that confluence of different actors in that converge and that convergence so that they can work together for the greater good. Thank you, Jonathan. Fernando, please. I think that part of what Jonathan was saying, the most important myth is that of the minimum state, that he already mentioned it. And then we have other myths too. Some of them are even pictorial, you know. When you see reform processes and myths start coming out, you know, how can we do to stop the tax from harming a certain person? So we start creating tax policies over exceptions. So then we have a poor, very, very poor exercise because we haven't been general and we haven't tried to address the exceptions. But I want to refer to two myths. One is that any tax sign is good, which probably hasn't happened through a serious technical analysis. This is how, for example, stimulus to investments have been created. And everyone in our countries want to invite investment, of course. But we haven't considered if the design of those incentives, the way it's proposed, is adequate for the goals that we want to achieve. Here, Costa Rica, and I think the same happens in other countries, when we talk about these things, the first thing you're told is, well, you want to prevent employment and then you're against employment creation. Well, no. Are you sure that the incentive that you have created is creating employment, or what we're doing is giving a higher value to income, to profit of this company beyond what they should be obtaining in normal situations? Because if I create a system that exempts me from profit, then what I create is a mechanism through which these companies start bringing their wealth to the country instead of creating employment, because it is very easy to do this today. So you see the numbers, you see that the regime is not the main source of employment creation, and then you say, well, something is wrong here with the incentive. Another case that's happening here is that it turns out that as a result of the pandemic, and because of the effect that working from home has had, then we have to consider the digital nomads. So the country is well positioned in this sense at a global level. So then we end up saying, you know what, the project that we have presented to create an exoneration for this group has to be approved to strengthen that. Well, I'm sorry, if something is functioning, why do we need to create a tax incentive if this is already happening without having the incentive there? Wouldn't it be better to ask ourselves through what what conditions were given for these people to live here, and how can we strengthen them using public resources. These type of discussions do not exist when we talk about stimulus, tax stimuli. And what this ends up causing is to create exaggerately exemptions and to erode the tax bases in tax systems at a regional level, which of course reduced resources collected, and with this the possibility to have an active tax policy. The other one is aid. Aid has been satanized by saying, let's not give a man a fish, but let's teach him how to fish. But well, while people learn how to fish, they could starve. So when satanizing assistance, what has been happening is that it is harder and harder to think about broad programs of social program granting in order to provide the minimum subsistence measures to wide population groups. Now, talking about taxes, whether temporary or permanent, to provide some basis to programs, assistance programs, is taboo. Well, it's best to have people with work. Well, but work by itself is not well paid and it doesn't have the right conditions, work conditions, then it won't solve people's problems. Many times people pay wages under the minimum wage, and many times they work on inappropriate work conditions. Many times people are not able to work an entire day. So we cannot assume or attempt for work to solve these problems by itself. Also, the compatibility of the work created in terms of work demand is not always exact. We won't have work for everyone. And the idea is that there is not a lot of work offered, for example, in qualified tasks, which are the one that offer dynamism the more in the markets. And there are people that cannot get work because they're not qualified or there are not enough conditions to do so. So I think in this sense, this is generating a very important gap for population to have access to minimum conditions to be able to enjoy their rights. And here we're talking about the state that's not able for this opportunity. And it doesn't give the material conditions for it to give a minimum condition. So here we have to think, and we've been working on it, how can we move towards a minimum vital income and later on think about a universal basic income without having to close ourselves to the mental barriers discourse that we create in our minds, because they are current. Most of the Central American population is not going to leave poverty conditions if we do not help them. Growth by itself is not going to solve these problems. And there are political processes. And I think that unfortunately, these austerity discourses have helped political parties, even those with progressive ideas, or that would appear to be so. And I think that here, regional organizations, think tanks, and as Efi said, and the institutions that I belong to, we have to demystify, we have to debunk many of these myths. And I think that, and we need to improve our input, because many times they stay at the technical level, that they do not reach population because of different regions. And in the university, in college, we just swamp in our own logic and we do not see the practical aspect of all of it. And we need to give a step forward, because we have to create the means to discuss this in practice. I read an article of Varoufakis, that was a minister of finance in Greece. It is very interesting, a very a very good discourse that he gave, a speech that was published in a journal that does not really agree with that ideas. But if we can do something like that, hear new ideas, maybe we would have a different result at a political process level. But we need that. Not only mobilization. as it's happening in Colombia and Chile, because it has happened, but when there is a temporary effervescence, it just eliminates very quickly. We need for it to get to Congress, because there's no other place where tax policy and pressures that we have, we don't have any other place where we have to bring the vote to the legislative branch, and that's what we have to do here. Thank you so much, Fernando. The discussion is very interesting. There are a lot of questions, and I'm sorry because we're not able to address them. But the scarcest asset that we have is time, you know. And now, to conclude our discussion, I'd like to invite Jose Maria Tojeda, father. He is a tractor, and currently he's the director of IDUCA, the Institute of Human Rights of certain university, and he is an untterrible defender of human rights. So, Father Tojeda, could you please share some reflections on these challenges that we have in terms of tax policy and human rights in a Central American context that every time more and more context, and El Salvador is not the exception? Thank you so much. Father, please. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. Well, evidently, the problem that you are talking about and the need of tax reform is linked to human rights, and not only with civil and political human rights, that of course encourages them, but it's also seen with social and economic assets. I see some difficulties in all of these, which is quite simple. So not only our states, but also peoples have tried to organize, and they have been achieving it, societies that marginalize many other people in their dignities, in their rights, of course, and that manage sometimes a 20, a 30, or up to a 40%. Costa Rica and Panama would be different, but in numbers or the way they manage it, well, they manage more people, but they manage a particular group of people, around 20%. And these are the ones that basically have rights established, both economic and social, and give more importance to political and civil rights. Or many times in El Salvador, we are clearly seeing it. There is a problem of poverty. 8% has the poverty rate grown. COVID has affected the country, but we do not really talk about social or economic rights. That's like fixed with some particular donations. We talk more about political and civil rights, which is okay given the totalitarianism of this person that's in front of the country, that leads the country. But what concerns me is that economic and social rights, let's say, power, whether it's companies, established politicians, traditional parties, etc. It's like the topic is, okay, just stop with political and social rights, with economic, political rights, sorry. The social ones are more important. So you see that people start caring more about the social and political rights, but when they're facing tax reform. And I find it amazing and ethical and indispensable for the development of our countries. But we need to look for the strategy of combining. I mean, we cannot say that political and civil rights are less important, because they are indispensable, yes. And with a dictatorship, it would be even worse. But if I think that we need to establish a strong link between civil and political rights and economic and social rights, I would be being honest with myself. So that authoritarianism shouldn't be heavier here. Of course, this has been a worsened problem due to COVID, which has weakened some populations. And of course, when there's a disaster, those who take advantage of certain groups of peoples, well, of course, just takes full advantage of it, plainly. And El Salvador knows how to use the strategy of becoming authoritarian, pleasing people in times of catastrophe, a firm authority. But at the same time, we provide some gifts of things or attention in comparison to other countries of the CA4, especially in vaccination programs. To say, hello, we are meeting with people, we are complying our responsibility with people, and look at this, but they're not really doing anything. So I think that in many of our countries, we have a huge amount of people that's easily manipulated in terms of economic and social rights, believing that these rights means that the state should give them something, or for it to be assistentialist or paternalistic. So there's a big group of those. And there's another group which is a little bit more aware that says many times when they are attacked in their political and civil rights, they forget about social and economic rights. And at the same time, business world that's not really aware at all of social and economic rights. The open business people are the ones that defend political and civil rights, but when it comes to the other rights, they just don't care. Now, thinking about universities and intellectuals in Central America, there is an ethical challenge here, I know. So with Jonathan and with Ricardo here in El Salvador, we have established a very good relationship. We have become very close because I truly see that they provide elements to those of us who defend human rights to insist on economic and social rights. Well, this insistence that I have put on social and economic rights, well, is part of my comment, the need to raise more awareness. But at the same time, I would like to thank INSEFI because it's one of the few institutions that help us, technically speaking, to elaborate and to stress on different aspects.
Derechos políticos y civiles en la práctica, en la conciencia de la gente, ¿verdad? Es decir, porque
that of course we can use in practice, because in theory we can just provide these courses for activists, because that's the way we are at times, you know, human rights defenders. And that's why we're interested in seeing how we can link this. We see this as a challenge, and of course, you are the ones who help us with the theoretical part, so it is very good to mention that. And that was the brief comment that I wanted to make. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Father Tojeira. So right now, and to conclude, I ask Rayleigh Dow, our illustrator, to show the summary of the event.
Muchísimas gracias, Rayleigh.
So thank you so much, Rayleigh. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time. As I was telling you, time is always a very scarce asset that we have in this type of discussions. And however, I invite all of you to leave additional comments and for you to have access to the shared document, so that we can keep on enriching this discussion on the principles of human rights in public policy. You can find the link to the shared point on the chat of this event. So I ask you to please keep on participating, keep on getting informed, and I'd like to thank you for your time. I would like to thank our panel members also for sharing and for adding to a discussion that does not end up here, but that we will be readdressing later on. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
¿Sabes cuál es la relación entre la política fiscal y los derechos humanos? Los derechos humanos son los derechos que toda persona tiene por existir. La política fiscal es la forma en la que el gobierno obtiene los recursos para financiarse y cómo los gasta después. Esta política puede promover o generar retrocesos en la garantía de los derechos humanos. En América Latina, la región más desigual en el mundo, durante la pandemia por COVID-19, 73 multimillonarios aumentaron su fortuna en $42.000 millones, mientras se estima que 52 millones de personas ya han entrado en la pobreza. Esto demuestra que los países de América Latina no están cumpliendo con los acuerdos internacionales de derechos humanos que suscribieron. Si estos acuerdos internacionales fueran cumplidos, la política fiscal estaría al servicio de las personas y sus derechos en vez de restringirlos, que es lo que sucede hoy en la región. Con eso en mente, 7 organizaciones en América Latina se propusieron analizar estos acuerdos internacionales y aclarar cuáles son las implicaciones en derechos en materia de política fiscal. Así, surgen los 15 principios de derechos humanos en la política fiscal, que al ser aplicados por los gobiernos asegurarían que las políticas fiscales estén al servicio de los derechos. Algunas de las ideas en el documento aclaran que el Estado necesita recaudar impuestos de manera justa, de forma que los más ricos contribuyan más. Que las mujeres, las personas afrodescendientes, los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades que han sufrido discriminaciones deben tener prioridad en las decisiones del gasto. Y que la política fiscal debe ser transparente, participativa y sujeta a la rendición de cuentas. Si quieres saber más, visita nuestro sitio web